Here's the thing with Epictetus, he does talk about virtue at some places, and it always is framed in that way, but those are determinate ways of framing it. And it dovetails with what we have with other Stoic philosophy. So I don't think that Epictetus, I was actually attracted to that idea a long time ago, and engaged in some like discussions online with Massimo, who was big pushing Seneca and the virtues. And I was like, yeah, but Epictetus, I think this is, what's going on here. Now I'm more convinced that there is, in the background of Epictetus's stuff, more of a harmony with the Stoic doctrines, and it's not just Chrysippus. Um, you know, Arius actually, it's interesting because there's secondary literature out there that will say that Arius is talking about Chrysippus at this point. If Arius isn't actually mentioning Chrysippus, it's not about Chrysippus, because Zeno also held to the unity of the virtues. And, later Stoics, like, looks like Panaetius and Posidonius are, accepting it as well. So I don't think it's just a Chrysippus came along, tried to synthesize and harmonize everything, but was very technical, and the others just kind of then go and do their own thing. It's a consistent doctrine. We find other authors being mentioned, Hecatao, with all this literature on what the virtues actually are. So, you know, I don't think that it's not something that we should say, well, it's irrelevant because Chrysippus was into it and the others really weren't into it. Virtue. Well, they don't tell you that. They give you a few lines where they're like, well, you're going to do the right thing reliably in these sort of circumstances. You won't feel, for example, in the emotions, unnatural fears. Plutarch at one point says, one way you can tell you're making progress in virtue is you don't believe the stupid things that you used to believe, right? That are leading you astray. And I think Stoics can get behind that as well. But you're right, there isn't a hard and fast rule. And this is pretty typical of virtue ethics and goes to one of the things that Mark was talking about. You get in situations and you have to ask yourself, what's justice in this situation? Now, we have seen there are some guidelines, right? Whether we accept those guidelines or not, that's kind of up to us. We could say in home furnishings to be temperate. Here's what Cicero says, and here's what Seneca says about that. But, it's still pretty vague, right? But you can say the same thing about other virtue ethics. Aristotle tells you in the beginning of Nicomachean Ethics that he's giving you outlines and you have to color in the parts, right? I would say no. And the same thing goes for like Clifton strengths developed by Gallup or all these other things that are often more temperament than actual moral virtues. Um, so, it's clear that what positive psychology is doing, it's drawing a little bit from Aristotle, and also from, you could say, a broadly Epicurean point of view as well. But it's doing so in often a kind of superficial way, even in Seligman's stuff. So I don't think strengths, it's too vague of a notion, and it doesn't provide us a lot of moral guidance, I would say. It can be very useful for like figuring out how to make a team work in a workplace or something like that. Yeah, strictly speaking, yes. But I think that one of the things that often gets left out in the literature that we would want to, if we want to like adapt this to the present, we do have to be willing to say, listen, there's a lot of things where the person wound up kind of having this inflicted on them, right? They can still, yeah. So Scott says, not sure this is something we have total control of. Yeah, and the Stoics, when we talk about the dichotomy of control, a lot of people go kind of overboard thinking, well, Epictetus says, I have control over my thoughts. So therefore, there are no such things as thoughts outside of my control. He's not asserting that every single thought or, desire or aversion you automatically always at every single time have control over. It's just potentially you could. But it often takes a lot of work. And we could, so think about depression, for example. Sometimes depression stems from things that are going wrong with your brain chemistry, and we sometimes can use talk therapy to help with that, but only help a certain amount. A lot of people respond better to drug therapy that changes the way their brain chemistry works. But then they're kind of stuck with that, right? If they go off of the medication, they might go back to the feelings that they had. A lot of depression is from dealing with traumas that have been inflicted on us at different points in our life. And, the same trauma may affect people in different ways. Somebody can lose, a job, a marriage, a parent, a child, and be very affected for years and years and years and years, right? Now, what Stoicism can help with, as I think other kinds of virtue ethics can help with, but not entirely on their own, is to like chip away at the parts where we actually do have some involvement, some matter of control, because one of the problems with depression is it's self-reinforcing, right? So you're depressed and you're like, oh, this thing that I'm trying to do, I'll never succeed with it. And well, then you don't work on it. And of course, you don't succeed with it, right? And you feel like crap again. A lot of, loops like that occur. And you can like look at your assumptions and you can look at things and again, chip away at it, try to change the habits somewhat. As Mark was talking about earlier, narrative plays a big role in this, telling yourself what character you are in the story can play a role. And then, there's other things where like we get hit with things that are more acute. You go through a bad breakup. Your school program isn't, working out the way that you wanted to. Pick whatever you want, right? Um, I mean, every semester you set up a class and things go off track in one way or another, right? And people can get depressed over stuff like that, right? I mean, you can have a susceptibility to feeling sad and you can kind of look at that and see whether there's anything that could be done. But the Stoics would say, I think a contemporary Stoic has to be willing to accept like the whole domain of what we call mental health, right? And say, yeah, there's going to be some things where you really need some other kind of intervention or some other way of approaching things. But you could say that the spectrum, from, like say strictly moral matters into matters of mental health, the Stoics are going to go pretty far in. If you are depressed, you can remind yourself throughout the day, I'm depressed. That tends to make me, make morose decisions. I better look at my decisions and practice some attentiveness. And some of the time do things that are uncomfortable for me, requiring the virtue of courage, or, don't eat your feelings, practice temperance, right? So it's not going to be like a very neat dividing line. And we saw Cicero is raising that very problem, right? Which is a real issue. Motivate me. I think that's the way a lot of people use the idea of the sage. Does anybody do the practice? And it's not a strictly Stoic practice. The Epicureans did this as well, of like visualizing yourself in the presence of the sage who then like assesses whether you're doing the right thing or not. I don't do it myself. But I read that other people advocate and use that practice. And it does appear to be something that was done in ancient times. For me, it's more like, thinking what would so and so, who I don't consider to be a sage but very smart, say to me about that. Okay, so, and I think that's pretty common in virtue ethics generally as well. So, and it could be like, let's say you were lucky enough to have family members who were really well developed morally. You can think, how did they handle this kind of situation? How do they display these virtues? You might also think about like ones that aren't so squared away. Let's not be like that one. What's the opposite of how they act? You know? I mean, jumping way ahead into the 18th century, Immanuel Kant, right? He's got this very rigorous moral philosophy that we're never going to measure up to. And he's like, you can never tell with any of your actions whether they're truly, in accordance with duty or whether there's a little bit of self-love in the background. And you're like, well, crap, then why should I bother with any of this, right? Well, there were a lot of people who put that into practice. And if you do, you're probably going to act like a much better person and be happier with your actions and your relationships. Um, so Marx says a synthesis of philosopher, saint, sadhu, and scientist. I mean, any one of those is hard to pull off, right? So bringing all those together is kind of tough. I think there is some benefit in pondering these matters, right? They're called paradoxes, rightly so, because they are contrary to our normal way of thinking about these matters, right? They're counterintuitive, we say. But there's two other
No,
things with the mud
it's
puddle
just
thing where you're like, well, why don't you raise your head up? Get your face out of the
yeah.
muck, right? Now, telling somebody to do that in the middle of the ocean, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you'll be fine, do the dog paddle or something like that. No, they're screwed. They're gonna drown. But yeah, if you're actually drowning like in a bathtub with 2 inches of water, something else led to that situation. Like, is somebody holding you down? What's wrong? With this picture or the blind thing too, right? Okay, so the puppy who's about to open its eyes is just as blind as the puppy when it was first born. No, it's not. It's about to open its eyes. And when it does open its eyes, it's not as if like, you know, a switch flips and now it sees everything. Have any of you, those of you who've had like little babies, you notice they can't see crap at first, right? And they slowly start to figure out what objects are and when we first wake up, some of us our eyes don't work perfectly and it takes a little bit of time for us to adjust as well, right? So I don't know. These arguments are kind of specious, right? Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, if we're gonna be sort of cookie cutter appliers of this, we would probably be like, that's a bad emotion, that's a bad emotion, that's a bad emotion. But Stoicism isn't about getting rid of emotions altogether. It's about figuring out why we feel the way that we do. And some of that might, in fact, be pretty complicated. If you feel a sense of envy over seeing somebody publishing something, which I've experienced in the past, probably will in the future, you can ask yourself, well, why do I have a judgment that this is a bad thing for me to begin with? Where is that coming from? What other dogmata, opinions or judgments are feeding into this? And so in order to like remedy it, you would have to do a good bit of work. Or here's another great example. So my oldest, well, actually both of my kids suffer from similar anger problems to my own. And one common issue that maybe some of you can relate to is getting ticked off when people get things wrong, you know, and like express something, they say that A is B and you're like, no, it isn't. Well, why do you care that they said something that's wrong? It's like the meme with the guy who his wife is like, come on, honey, come to bed. And he's like, no, I can't. Somebody's saying something wrong on the internet, and he's got to correct them, right? Where does that come from? You can dig in and you can like analyze things and be like, aha, here's a couple wrong assumptions I'm making. Like, it's my job to make sure nobody gets anything wrong. Or if somebody gets something wrong, that's going to lead everybody else so far astray, people often have these irrational judgments in them. So yeah, I think that's right. That's not a bad idea. So, like, virtue, I mean, this makes it more Platonic, I think, where virtue is like a pattern or a paradigma. And then when I have justice in myself, I have like a replication of that pattern in the matter that is this guy over here. And likewise, when you have it, you have a similar pattern. And maybe our patterns aren't, perfectly identical. But they're similar. That's a pretty pragmatic point of view, and I think that could be perfectly fine. Um, you could say, yeah, I'll worry about sagehood when I actually run into one. You know, until then, let's just like try to be not so screwed up. And I think so. James said, when I'm clearly trying to do better with managing what I control, there's results. And it's sort of like going on a diet. With any diet, you should lose some weight, at least at first, right? Because you're actually, or any exercise program, if you go to the gym, provided you don't hurt yourself, you should see some gains because you're actually doing something that's a prerequisite for all the other things. So if you're like looking at your character daily and you're like, there whatever number of virtues we want to come up with, I want to be a better person. I want to be less of a screw up. That's likely to pay off unless you screw yourself up by like trying to compare yourself immediately to everybody else, or it's really about you blogging about your wonderful journey into self-transformation, and you're doing that more than you're actually like trying not to be a jerk to people, or trying not to eat too much or things like that. So yeah, I'm pretty like Cicero, pretty eclectic about these sorts of things myself. I think the Stoics are great. I also like Aristotle a lot. I also like Plutarch a lot. The virtues. Yeah, very, very much so. I mean, Aristotle has two states in between virtue on one side and vice on the other side. One of those is what is called akrasia, which we can translate as like lack or loss of self-control. Older fashioned things call it incontinence, or stuff like that. And so that is when you do things that are characteristic of vicious behavior, but you're not yet vicious. So think about people who are intemperate when it comes to um, alcohol, right? So normally you're not like, you're not drinking a six pack every night or something like that, but you go to the holiday party and it's an open bar and you're like, I should only have three drinks. By the way, this is actually an issue that I bring up in my business ethics classes when we're talking about virtue ethics. I always ask them, company holiday party, open bar, you're expected to be there. How many drinks should you have? And some people will be like, you shouldn't have any drinks at all. And then most of my students, now this is granted, this is in Wisconsin, will gravitate around three drinks, you know, not so much that you're going to get sloshed and do or say things that are embarrassing and potentially screw up your workplace. And oftentimes they'll differentiate two drinks for a woman, three drinks for a man because of different body sizes. Some will say one drink, and then the rest will be like, well, you should probably have more than that. But nobody thinks you should have six drinks, or 12 drinks, or, it's an open bar. It's a perk. You should drink as much as you possibly can on the company dime. Nobody says that, right? And so we could think about things like that. So the Socratic person goes to the company party and they have six drinks. because they start out, I'll only have two or three. And then, they're hanging out with their colleagues and they're like, yeah, maybe one more, and then somebody's like, let's do shots. And they're like, well, I wasn't going to do shots, but why not, and then, oh, we should have one more for the road, and now they're loaded, right? So loss of self-control, if you're doing that enough, you'll become vicious, Aristotle says. And then there's self-control. And when you're self-controlled, you do the right things, but you're not really fully motivated to do the right things. It hasn't become second nature for you as it is for the virtuous person. So let's take a virtue like generosity. So, you want to help people out, but you feel a sense of like, pain or something, giving money away. And you're like, it's the right thing to do. I'll do it. And I wish I felt better about this, but this is good enough, Well, if you do that enough, you'll become virtuous, according to Aristotle. So Aristotle definitely believes in progress and there being a middle position. And, Aristotle was so persuasive about this that the Platonists bought into his idea and incorporated parts of it into their own philosophy after Plato, with the Middle Platonists. So